Hello and welcome to the Summersworth Book Nook, a podcast about all things books, publishing and more. My name is Emma and today my guest is Alex Hayward. Alex is a playwright. Now on with the show. Thank you for coming on the podcast today, Alex.
Not a problem at all. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no worries. So first things first, how did you begin your writing journey?
Yeah, so I've always been writing stories, but they were mostly prose. I was kind of really trying to write novels, I think, for a very long time, and always had a difficulty finishing them, quite frankly. It was only really through university and having a creative writing teacher who told me that the dialogue was probably the best aspect of the stories. I don't think he meant to be damning about the description, but thinking back on it, I realized how much I preferred kind of writing scenes of people sort of talking to each other and writing those characters and thinking about that rather than necessarily describing things. But despite all of that, it took me a very long time before I actually got round to writing a play. But I think when I gave it a go, I was really sort of amazed at why I hadn't been doing it the whole time. Um, I suppose not just in terms of writing the dialogue, but I think the main thing for me was that writing novels is a very long, very time intensive process. And maybe I either don't have the kind of like patience or fortitude to see it through. With a play, you can have an idea and you can plan it out. And for me personally, I can write it a lot faster, and that kind of immediacy is quite exciting. So that's kind of how I started, I suppose, and that's what I'm still doing now is mostly just focusing on the playwriting purely for that reason.
Yeah, of course. It's as I said, writing a novel is obviously for some people, and then writing a script is, for others, or if they want to try a hand at it. As I said, it's just finding your niche with your writing and what you actually want to write.
Absolutely, yeah.
Awesome. So obviously you've had a few plays, obviously that have gone on stage and they've done very well. What would you say when you first obviously started writing your plays? And what were the key things you had to think about when you obviously started or began?
Sure. I think when I first started writing plays, I kind of just I didn't really think so much about staging at all. I just had an idea for something and I did a lot of research and I enjoyed kind of writing these extensive kind of like soliloquies and all the rest of it. But then I gave it to an agent and they came back to me and said, yeah, it reads very well, but I can't really imagine this being staged. They couldn't really see what the dramatic element of it was. Um, so I suddenly had to think a lot more in terms of this isn't for the page, it isn't to be read, it's to be performed. And so you have to think about things in terms of not just what is a cool line, what's a nice, sort of snappy bit of dialogue, but rather how can I make this something that would be immersive and exciting to watch? And also, how can I make something that other people can understand and get into and have the space to kind of experiment with as well? Because you're also writing for a director, you're writing for actors, and you're writing for a production team. So, in a way, I think you have to write a lot more openly. Um, and you kind of just have to sort of, I guess, create that space where, yeah, sure, it is your idea, but there also has to be room for other people to come in and interpret it in ways. So I think that's probably the main thing I had to think about for sure.
It's plays are more, I would say, a collaborative effort. Would you say when
Absolutely.
you're putting it on? Obviously, you've got, as you said, you've got actors, you've got directors, you've got producers, you've got everybody. So I guess
Hmm.
it's you have to sort of work as a team.
Yeah, I mean, but that's exactly why I like it, to be honest. I think one of the problems I had when writing novels and prose, and I think this goes for writers anywhere, to be honest, but it can be very lonely. And when it is just you, I mean, ultimately, you're the kind of it all falls to you to brood to create the thing. Um, it's a lot easier when you have other people that you can bounce ideas off because it makes the work a lot stronger and it makes it a lot better. You have to be vulnerable in certain ways because you're going to have differences and disagreements over how things should work. But I think for me, the real beauty of theatre and working with it is that it does involve other people and it does involve a community effort, and that in itself is very powerful, I think. And it certainly is I think very useful. I mean, I would recommend sort of finding other people who can relate to the writing experience as much as possible, no matter what you're writing. Communities are incredibly important, and that's probably what makes theatre great, I would say.
Yeah, of course. So obviously with your plays, not just obviously the writing process, but obviously putting it on and getting people together to make the to get it ready for opening night. What would you say the key
Hmm.
challenges were of doing that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think with theatre, the main kind of challenges come down to, well, budget would be the main one. But I think also just you kind of it's so, especially at the level at which I'm working, which is fringe essentially. So a lot of people have to double up in lots of different roles. I personally was, I suppose, producing the plays as well and organizing quite a lot of things with regard to sort of finding rehearsal space and also not just financing it, but making sure that everything was ready, I suppose. I mean, part of that job is also down to other people in the team. The challenges I found were not just budgetary, however, I think it's also because you're so much closer to the production, and that can be very stressful in its own way. It's exhilarating at the same time. I mean, I remember when I was putting on the show, I think we had something like 2 or 3 hours to tech both of the plays because it was a double bill and we couldn't get into the venue. So we were just sort of standing outside on this raining morning, waiting to be let in to even do a dress rehearsal, actually. The time you have is incredibly limited, and that can be quite tough as well. And if people pull out of the production, certainly in terms of acting, as we had that issue as well, you have to have the other issue of people learning lines and things like that. I always remember what someone on the team said, which was, "It will be all right on the night because it has to be." And I think if that really just sums up theatre, to be honest, and sums up its challenges. It is stressful, it is nerve-wracking, but it's also incredibly exciting and absolutely worthwhile. But yeah, I think those are the kind of things that you have to really consider for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like the community is sort of very supportive of people. If obviously it's something new or something goes wrong. As I said, it's a collaborative effort, so you don't
Yeah,
feel like everything is going wrong. So you've got people you can go
yeah.
rely on.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think the other thing that I've found really encouraging is just the amount of people that have offered kind of advice and opinions, and I'm not saying this is the case all across the industry. It is an industry with a great deal of issues, particularly with regard to access. But certainly when I was trying to get into theatre, I would volunteer at theatres. 503 is particularly welcoming, but there are lots of others as well, Bunker as well. And I would get into conversations with people who worked there, and they were always very keen to sort of find out a little bit about what I was doing and share experiences that they had had. And all of that is incredibly key. And so, yeah, I mean, it is tough, there's a lot of challenges, but I think having other people to talk to and to give their opinion, and to feel like, it's not a big deal. That is incredibly important as well, and certainly something that I've really found very encouraging, very positive, and sort of more reasons why I'm excited about working in it.
Yeah, of course. So, kind of like moving on, going back to writing, what advice would you give to someone that maybe wants to start writing a play or a script?
Sure. Yeah. I think, I mean, it's odd because it sort of changes over time. Before, I would have been very analytical and I would have said, okay, plan out every single thing that happens in your story. And I think that is obviously important, but I would actually now probably think more in terms of asking yourself questions before you start anything. If you think something is a good idea, and I think there's two questions that you need to ask yourself before you write something. And the first is, why does this story need to be told? And the second is, why do I need to be the person telling it? The reason I say this is because, not just because there's a lot of duplication, and it's certainly not every single story has to be this incredibly searing, important, socially serious thing. I just think it's worthwhile to kind of ground what you're writing in. You need to be the person to sort of sing its praises. You need to be the person to kind of convince people that it's something that needs to exist and needs to be in the world. And so I think it's important to start off on that footing. And the second one, just in terms of thinking about why you need to be able to tell it, there are plenty of times where there are things that seem like really great ideas, but then you almost wonder, well, maybe somebody else is sort of better positioned to tell this story. Maybe they have experiences that would align with it better. And in that case, that opens up another sort of dimension of, well, maybe I need to go to other people. And again, it comes back to that sort of collaboration. So I think those are kind of the two things to ground it. And also, I would say find like-minded people and create a community or join a community. The internet is terrible in many ways, but it's also been pretty good just for, quite frankly, finding other writers, finding other creative people who are working on things, get together, share kind of ideas, talk about what you're working on. That kind of support network is incredibly crucial as well. And then also, one final thing is just find out a bit more about how the industry works. I was writing scripts for quite a while, and all kinds of other sort of bits of fiction, but it was only really when I just went to a theatre and said, do you need a hand doing box office every now and then? And it was kind of that's how I ended up getting a rehearsed reading. That's how I was able to put something on. Ultimately, it all comes down to relationships too. So that's very important as well. So yeah, I would say think about why you're writing it, create a community or join a community, and learn the ins and outs of the industry by just offering to help out where you can.
Yeah, of course. I think definitely sort of the community thing is becoming more and more. I know it's always been there, but it's been sort of like quite a big thing in the writing community as well. And even like I was speaking to a freelance a couple of weeks ago that they all get together and work together.
Yeah.
Like they go to a cafe or something and they all like start writing or doing stuff, and that's quite a nice way of sort of bouncing ideas and, as I said, meeting people. So it sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, well, I just think it's very important to know that other people are doing it. Other people have the same kind of struggles that you have. Obviously, it's important to, take pride in your work and take pride in who you are as a person and your kind of abilities as a creative. But nobody gets by, nobody succeeds purely on their own. It's always the help of so many other different aspects, and I think it's important to think about writing in that way, thinking of it more as a kind of collective thing too. I think is really worthwhile and certainly has helped me a lot.
That's awesome. So finally, obviously I know we sort of talk a bit about obviously books on this podcast, but is there a book that you have read recently or listened to that you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, I really should get into listening to books. I know that audiobooks at the moment are kind of sort of quite a favored way of listening to things. I would recommend a book by a writer called Ollie Mould, and it's called Against Creativity. And it's not a work of fiction or anything like that. It's, I suppose, really about reclaiming creativity and how creative people need to think more in terms of what it means to be creative, but in a less commodified way, I suppose. He makes the argument that over the past 30 or 40 years, people have had to kind of accept this idea that, well, you can only really be creative if you can make money off it. And ultimately, there is a harsh truth in that. A lot of people have to work jobs and have day jobs in order to support it. And it is very difficult to make a living purely from writing. But I think the reason why I would recommend this book is that it just encourages you to take pride in what you're doing, less as a means of creating money and more as something that is socially worthwhile, individually worthwhile, something that could be utopian, can inspire all kinds of new and exciting ways of thinking about ourselves and society. And ultimately, without wanting to sound too corny about it, something that can be joyous. If life is meant to be anything, and writing is meant to be anything, it should inspire those kind of feelings. That's my sort of perspective on it. So Against Creativity, I would highly recommend for those reasons.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Bye. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. You can follow Alex on Twitter at Alex Hayward. If you'd like to get involved with the podcast, you can get in touch through Twitter at novelm16 and use the hashtag slothcast, or you can send me an email at slumberyslothbooknook@gmail.com. You can always find our podcast on our YouTube channel, Slumbery Sloth Book Nook, or you can download it from Podbean and Apple Podcasts for an on-the-go experience. See you next week. Bye.